The bank in Redemption, Arizona was a quiet place. On a Tuesday afternoon, a sanctuary of cool shadow against the relentless glare of the sun. Dust motes danced in the slanted shafts of light, each a tiny world spinning in the silence. Jack Thorne sat on a bench against the far wall, nursing a canteen of lukewarm water, his hat tipped low over his eyes. He wasn't there for business. He was just passing through another ghost in a long line of ghost towns, each one a monument to a past he was trying to outrun. His face was a road map of hard miles, etched by sun and grief, and his eyes, when he bothered to open them, held the weary patience of a man who expected nothing good from the world and was rarely disappointed. Redemption itself was a testament to failed hopes. Unpainted wooden storefronts listed like tired old men, their signs bleached bone-white by the relentless Arizona sun. The wind whispered down the single dusty street, carrying the scent of alkali and regret. It was the kind of town you ended up in, not the kind you chose. For Jack, it was just another stop on a journey to nowhere. The sudden crash of the double doors shattered the afternoon calm. 3 men stormed in their faces, obscured by grimy bandanas, and their movements sharp and practiced. The air once still crackled with violence. The teller, a young man with a face full of frightened pimples, threw his hands up so fast he nearly knocked over his inkwell. Nobody moves. Nobody gets hurt. The leader barked, his voice a low, confident growl. He was taller than the others, with a cruel elegance to his posture that seemed out of place in the grubby chaos of a robbery. Jack didn't move. He had seen this 100 times before. As a Texas Ranger, he'd been the one charging through the doors. Now, as a bounty hunter, he was usually the one cleaning up the mess. Today, he was just a bystander, and he intended to stay that way. He had no stake in this town's money. He had no stake in anything. The 2 shorter men vaulted over the counter, stuffing wads of cash into canvas bags. But the leader, the tall one, didn't seem interested in the money. His eyes, cold as river stones above his bandana, scanned the room. They settled on an elderly woman clutching a worn reticule to her chest, her lips moving in a silent prayer. He strode toward her, his spurs ringing softly on the wooden floor. "Ma'am," he said, his voice dropping to a silken, menacing purr. "I'll be taking that." The woman flinched, holding the reticule tighter. "It's all I have. I'm not interested in your coin." The outlaw said, his patience wearing thin. He snatched the bag from her grasp, tore it open, and let the few coins clatter to the floor. His gloved fingers fished inside and pulled out a small silver locket tarnished with age. He held it up to the light, a small, satisfied smile playing on his lips. And in that moment, Jack Thorne's world stopped. Time seemed to warp and stretch. The shouts of the robbers, the woman's soft gasp, the frantic rustle of stolen money, it all faded into a dull, distant roar. All Jack could see was the locket. It was oval-shaped, with a delicate etching of a mockingbird on its surface. It was identical to the one he had given his wife Sarah on their wedding day. The one she had been wearing the night the raiders came. The one that was lost in the ash and blood of his former life. A memory sharp and unwelcome, as a knife in the ribs tore through him. Sarah laughing in the sunlight, her hand instinctively going to the locket at her throat. His son Daniel reaching for the shiny object with his small, chubby fingers. The warmth of his home, the smell of baking bread, the feeling of a life built and cherished. Then another memory, darker, hotter. The scent of smoke, the screams, the splintered door frame. Finding Sarah on the floor, her eyes wide and unseeing, the space at her throat empty where the locket should have been. The bank in Redemption dissolved. He was back in the ruins of his ranch, the silence of death, a heavy blanket smothering the world. The pain he had spent 5 years burying, 5 years running from, erupted like a volcano. His hardened exterior, the cynical shell of the bounty hunter, shattered into 1,000 pieces. The tall outlaw pocketed the locket and turned to leave. "Let's go," he commanded his men. Something inside Jack snapped. The weary bystander was gone, replaced by a man with nothing left to lose and a ghost to avenge. He rose from the bench, his movements slow, deliberate. "Hold on," he said, his voice a low rasp, raw, with a pain so deep it sounded like gravel. The leader, Silas Kane, turned a flicker of annoyance in his eyes. "I said nobody moves." "That locket," Jack said, taking a step forward. "Where did you get it?" Silas chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "Finders keepers, friend. Now sit down before you find something you don't want." But Jack couldn't sit down. He couldn't breathe. This wasn't about money anymore. It was about the last tangible piece of a life that had been stolen from him. It was personal. He took another step, his hand moving instinctively toward the Colt Peacemaker holstered at his hip. Dust kicked. Glass shattered. The shot echoed. But it wasn't from Jack's gun. One of Silas's men, spooked by the confrontation, had fired wildly, the bullet tearing through the window and into the street outside. In the ensuing chaos, Silas and his men bolted out the door, disappearing into the blinding sunlight. Jack stood frozen in the middle of the bank, his hand hovering over his gun. The robbery was over. The money was gone. But for Jack Thorne, a hunt had just begun. He wasn't after a bounty. He was hunting a ghost, and he would follow it to the very gates of hell for the answer to one question: why did a common outlaw have his dead wife's locket? The aftermath of the robbery settled over redemption like a shroud. The young teller was shaking, the old woman was weeping softly, and Marshal Evans had finally arrived, his face a mask of tired resignation. He was a man well past his prime, with a drooping mustache and eyes that had seen too many suns set on too much trouble. "Just another damn Tuesday," he sighed, surveying the scene. He looked at Jack, who was still standing motionless, his gaze fixed on the empty doorway. "You all right, stranger?" Jack didn't answer. He was listening to the fading echo of hoofbeats, the sound pulling him back 5 years to a different night, filled with fire and terror. He could feel the phantom heat on his skin, smell the cinders of his burned-out life. He had been a Texas Ranger, then a man who believed in law, in order. But the law hadn't been there when the raiders swept down on his isolated ranch. They had come like a plague, swift and merciless, leaving nothing but scorched earth and bodies. He'd found Sarah and 4-year-old Daniel in the ashes of their home. The official report called it a random Apache raid, a tragic but common story on the frontier. Jack had quit the Rangers the next day. Justice was just a word rich men used before they hung poor ones. Vengeance, however, was a language he understood. For 5 years he had channeled his grief into a cold, efficient rage, hunting down wanted men for money. But he was really hunting for a release that never came. Until now, that locket wasn't just a piece of silver. It was a key. A random raid wouldn't have involved a specific personal theft. For the first time in 5 years, the narrative of that night felt wrong. "I'm going after him," Jack said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. He walked over to the marshal, his eyes finally focusing. Evans grunted, pulling a notepad from his pocket. "Name's Silas Kane. Got a reputation for being slicker than a greased pig." "You a lawman?" "Not anymore," Jack said. He took something. "I want it back." Before the marshal could respond, the door to his office swung open and a woman entered. She moved with a purpose that seemed to defy the town's weary atmosphere. She was dressed in practical buckskin trousers and a dusty linen shirt, her face framed by auburn hair, pulled back in a tight braid. Her eyes, the color of moss, were clear and intelligent, but shadowed with worry. "Marshal, we need to talk," she said, her voice direct and strong. She stopped when she saw Jack, her gaze assessing him for a brief, guarded moment. "Now, Eleanor, can't you see I've got a situation here?" Evans said, gesturing vaguely at the mess in the bank. "My situation isn't going to wait, Marshal," she insisted. "Another dozen head of my cattle were driven off last night, and someone poisoned the north well. I'm being pushed, and you know it. If I lose that water, I lose my ranch." Marshal Evans sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "It's probably just scavengers, Eleanor. Times are hard." "This isn't scavengers," she countered, her voice rising with frustration. "This is methodical. Someone wants my land." Jack listened, a flicker of interest cutting through his single-minded focus. Her problem felt distant, another person's trouble, in a world full of it. Yet the name of her ranch, the Vance homestead, rang a faint, discordant bell in the back of his mind. Evans offered her a placating smile. "I'll look into it, I promise. Just give me a few days to sort this unpleasantness." Eleanor Vance looked from the marshal's non-committal face to Jack's grim, unreadable one. She clearly saw no help coming from either of them. With a frustrated sigh, she turned and left the door swinging shut behind her, leaving a silence filled with unspoken tensions. Jack turned his attention back to Evans. "Kane, which way did he go?" The marshal shrugged. "Hard to say. His kind disappears into the Badlands like smoke. He's a ghost, son. Not worth the trouble for a piece of jewelry." But Jack was already moving toward the door. It was worth more than trouble. It was worth everything. He stepped out into the oppressive heat, the sun beating down on the cracked alkali flats. The distant mesas shimmered like ghosts in the heat haze. His past, once a thing to be buried, had just been violently resurrected. For 5 years he had been running from the memory of that night. Now he was running toward it. He wasn't hunting Silas Kane for a bounty. He was hunting him for the truth, and he had a chilling suspicion that the truth was buried somewhere deep in the very past he'd tried so hard to escape. The trail leading out of redemption was a faint scar on the face of the desert, easily lost to the shifting winds. But Jack Thorne was a master of this unforgiving language. He saw what other men missed, the subtle depression in the sand, from a shod hoof, a freshly broken creosote branch, the glint of a discarded shell casing. He rode with a singular focus, the image of the locket burned into his mind. The sun was a hammer, the heat a physical weight, but Jack felt none of it. He was fueled by a cold fire that had been banked for 5 long years. He rode for 2 days, pushing himself and his horse to the limits of their endurance. The landscape grew more hostile, the gentle plains giving way to the treacherous badlands, a maze of sun-baked canyons and jagged rock formations that could hide an army. It was perfect country for an ambush. Jack knew it. He could feel it in the unnatural silence, in the way the lizards scurried for cover as he passed. He was riding through a narrow arroyo, the canyon walls rising steeply on either side, when the feeling sharpened into certainty. He reined in his horse, his eyes scanning the ridgeline above. Nothing, not a flicker of movement. But his instincts, honed by years, as a ranger screamed at him. He dismounted, pulling his Winchester from its scabbard, and led his horse into the meager shade of an overhang. He waited. The silence was absolute, broken only by the buzz of a lone fly and the soft stamp of his horse's hoof. Minutes stretched into an eternity. Then a tiny sound, the soft scrape of a boot on sandstone from the ridge to his right. Jack didn't hesitate. He raised the Winchester and fired not at the sound, but at a cluster of loose rocks just above it. The bullet struck with a sharp crack, unleashing a small avalanche of stone and dust that rained down on the hidden gunman's position. A startled curse echoed through the canyon, followed by the deafening report of a rifle. The shot went wide, ricocheting off the canyon wall with a high-pitched whine. From the opposite ridge, a second rifle opened up. They had him pinned. It was a classic pincer trap. Amateurish, but effective if your target was careless. Jack was not careless. He dove behind a large boulder as bullets chewed at the rock around him, sending chips of stone flying like shrapnel. He was being hunted. Silas Kane wasn't just running. He was watching his back trail. This wasn't the work of a desperate outlaw trying to escape. This was calculated. Silas knew he was being followed, and he had left his hounds to deal with the problem. Jack peered around the edge of the boulder. One of the gunmen, emboldened by his silence, was shifting position, trying to get a better angle. It was the mistake Jack had been waiting for. He brought the Winchester to his shoulder, took a steadying breath, and squeezed the trigger. The shot was clean. The man on the ridge cried out and tumbled from view, one down. The other shooter, now more cautious, fell silent. The canyon was quiet again, but this time it was a tense, waiting silence. Jack knew the man wouldn't stay hidden forever. He crawled to the other side of his cover, using the terrain to his advantage. He was no longer the prey. He moved with the quiet efficiency of a predator, circling around through a series of rockfalls and crevices until he was above and behind the second gunman's position. The man was crouched behind a scraggly juniper, his eyes fixed on the boulder where Jack had been moments before. "Looking for me." Jack's voice was quiet, but it carried in the still air like the crack of a whip. The man spun around his face, a mask of shock and fear. He tried to bring his rifle to bear, but he was too slow. Jack's Colt was already leveled, the hammer cocked. "Drop it." The rifle clattered to the ground. The man was young, barely out of his teens, his eyes wide with terror. "Why?" Jack asked, his voice low and dangerous. "Who hired you?" "Kane," the kid stammered. "Silas Kane. He said a bounty hunter was on his tail. Told us to slow you down." "He's not just a common thief, is he?" Jack pressed, stepping closer. "There's more to this." The kid shook his head frantically. "I don't know nothing. We just do what he says. He pays well." Jack looked down at the rifle the kid had dropped. It was a standard model, but the ammunition pouch next to it caught his eye. He knelt and picked up a single cartridge. The casing was unusual, made of polished brass with a small stylized T stamped into the base. He had seen casings like this before a long time ago. They were custom-made, expensive. The kind of ammunition favored by wealthy landowners who liked to show off their bespoke firearms. The kind his father, Augustus Thorne, used to hand out as gifts to his business partners. A cold dread seeped into Jack's bones. This wasn't a coincidence. The locket, the custom ammunition, it was all connected. Silas Kane wasn't just an outlaw. He was a message. He looked back at the terrified young man. He had no more use for him. "Get on your horse and ride," Jack ordered. "And if I ever see you again, I won't be in a talking mood." The kid scrambled away, disappearing over the ridge as if the devil himself were on his heels. Jack stood alone in the silent canyon, the brass casing feeling heavy in his palm. He had survived the ambush, but he had walked into a much larger trap. His hunt for Silas Kane had now become a hunt into his own past, into the long, dark shadow cast by his father. And he was beginning to suspect that whatever he found there would be far more dangerous than any outlaw's bullet. The custom shell casing changed everything. It was a breadcrumb leading back to a life Jack had fought to leave behind. His father, Augustus Thorne, had been a titan of the territory, a man who built an empire of cattle land and mining interests on a foundation of ruthless ambition. He saw the world in terms of assets and liabilities, and people were no different. Jack had loathed the cold calculus of his father's world, choosing the simple, stark morality of a ranger's badge instead. When Augustus died of a heart attack a year after the raid, Jack hadn't even attended the funeral. He thought he had severed all ties to that life. Now it was reaching out from the grave. Instead of continuing his direct pursuit of Silas Kane, Jack turned his horse and rode for the territorial capital. The answers he needed weren't in the Badlands. They were in dusty land deeds and freight manifests. For a week, he immersed himself in the dry, brittle records of his father's business dealings. A pattern quickly emerged. A freight company in Prescott recently robbed. A land office in Flagstaff, its records mysteriously burned. A silver assay office in Tucson hit by a brazen daylight raid. Each of these businesses had one thing in common. They were all once owned by, or deeply indebted to, Augustus Thorne. Silas Kane wasn't committing random acts of banditry. He was systematically dismantling his father's empire piece by painful piece. And then he founded the connection he'd been dreading. The Vance homestead, the ranch belonging to the determined woman from the marshal's office, was situated on a plot of land with the territory's most reliable water rights. Records showed that Augustus Thorne had spent years trying to acquire it, using every legal and financial weapon at his disposal to squeeze the Vance family out. They had refused to sell. According to the deeds, Eleanor's ranch was the last independent holdout in a valley his father had wanted to control completely. Silas Kane wasn't just targeting Augustus Thorne's legacy. He was finishing his work. Jack rode back toward redemption, a cold knot of certainty in his gut. Eleanor Vance wasn't just a victim of circumstance. She was Silas Kane's next target. He found her mending a fence line, her face smudged with dirt and grim with determination. The sun beat down, but she worked with a steady, practiced rhythm, refusing to be broken by the heat or the pressure. She looked up as he approached her hand. Dropping to the pistol on her hip, her eyes narrowed with suspicion. "You're a long way from chasing your thief," she said, her tone sharp. "Our thief," Jack corrected, dismounting. "His name is Silas Kane, and he's not after your cattle. He's after your land. Your ranch is next on his list." She stared at him, her expression a mixture of skepticism and weariness. "And how would a bounty hunter know that you run with his kind?" "I used to run from his kind." Jack said, his voice quiet. He explained what he'd discovered, the pattern of attacks, the connection to his father. He left out the locket, the wound too raw to share. "My father. He wanted this valley. He wanted your ranch." Eleanor's face hardened. "I know who your father was. Augustus Thorne tried to ruin my family for a decade. We buried my father last year, broken from the stress of fighting him." The animosity in her voice was palpable. She saw him not as an individual, but as the son of her family's greatest enemy. "I am not my father." Jack said the words, tasting like ash in his mouth. It was a sentence he had been repeating his entire life. "But Kane is connected to him, and that makes you his target. You need help." "I don't need help from a Thorne," she shot back, but the conviction in her voice wavered. She was strong, but she was also alone, and she knew it. The poisoned well and the stolen cattle were just the beginning. "You don't have to trust me," Jack said, "but trust the facts. Kane is coming for you. Let me help you prepare. We can set a watch, fortify the homestead." She studied him for a long, silent moment, and the wind whipping loose strands of her auburn hair across her face. He could see the conflict in her eyes, and the deep-seated distrust of his name warring with the pragmatic need for an ally. Finally, she gave a curt nod. "Fine," she said. "You can stay in the barn. But if I see you so much as look at my property the wrong way, I'll put a bullet in you myself." Thorne or no Thorne, it was a reluctant alliance born of mutual desperation. Over the next few days, they worked together, a tense silence hanging between them. Jack, using his ranger training, helped her set up defensive positions around the ranch house. Eleanor, with her intimate knowledge of the land, showed him the hidden gullies and box canyons that could be used for an attack or an escape. They spoke only when necessary, their conversations clipped and practical. Jack knew he needed more information. He sent a carefully worded wire to Marshal Evans, asking for any territorial records on known associates of Silas Kane, or any mention of old land disputes involving Augustus Thorne. He hoped the seemingly incompetent marshal might stumble upon something useful. Days passed. The response from Evans was slow in coming, and when it did, it was useless. The wire claimed the territorial records were a mess and that Kane was a ghost with no known history. It sent Jack on a false lead, suggesting Kane's gang was last seen miles to the south near the Mexican border. It was a deliberate misdirection designed to pull Jack away from the ranch. It felt wrong, too convenient. The marshal's incompetence was beginning to feel like something else entirely. Something calculated. The seed of suspicion planted in the canyon began to sprout. He was being played not just by Silas, but by the law in redemption itself. The trap was simple. An old abandoned line shack at the far edge of Eleanor's property, a perfect spot for rustlers to lie low before a raid. Jack and Eleanor had spent the better part of a day rigging it, making it seem like an easy target. They waded through the cold desert night, hidden in a rocky outcrop overlooking the shack, the silence broken only by the cry of a distant coyote. Just before dawn they came. 3 of Cain's men, moving with quiet confidence, their rifles held at the ready. They were there to sabotage the last clean well on the property, a final blow to cripple the ranch. When they were inside the shack, Jack gave the signal. Gunfire erupted from 2 directions, pinning the men down. The fight was short and brutal. 2 of the outlaws fell in the first volley. The third, a wiry man with a desperate look in his eyes, was hit in the leg. He collapsed, clutching the wound, his pistol falling from his grasp. Jack moved in cautiously, his Colt steady. Eleanor covered him from the ridge. The wounded man glared up at him, a mixture of pain and defiance on his face. "It's over," Jack said. "Talk, and you might live to see a doctor." The man spat a bloody curse. "Cain will kill you both." He doesn't forget. He remembers everything. Remembers what Jack pressed, kneeling beside him. What is this all about? Why this ranch? The outlaw's breathing was shallow, his life ebbing away. He looked past Jack, his eyes unfocused, as if seeing a ghost. Redfield. He gasped the name, a ragged whisper. He remembers. For Redfield. The name hung in the cold morning air, meaningless and yet heavy with significance. Jack had never heard it before. It wasn't a name from his father's business dealings, not one he could recall from any record. It was a loose thread, a piece of a puzzle he couldn't see. "What is Redfield?" Jack demanded, grabbing the man's collar. "Who is Redfield?" But the man's eyes glazed over. A final shuddering breath escaped his lips, and he went still. Jack stood up, the outlaw's last word echoing in his mind. Redfield. It was nothing. And it was everything. It shifted the foundation of his quest. This wasn't just about his father's business. It wasn't just about land or money. There was a name attached to this vengeance, a name that predated everything Jack thought he knew. He looked over at Eleanor, who was making her way down from the ridge, her face pale but resolved. She had seen the look on his face, heard the dying man's last word. "What did he mean?" she asked. "I don't know," Jack said, the cold truth of the words settling deep in his soul. "But I'm beginning to think we've been fighting the wrong war." The name Redfield was a key to a lock Jack didn't know existed. It haunted him, a ghost, whispering at the edge of his thoughts. He wired every contact he had left from his ranger days, searching for any record, any mention of the name in connection to Augustus Thorne or the Arizona territory. The answers were all the same, nothing. The name was a dead end. He and Eleanor existed in a state of high alert, the tension on the ranch a palpable thing. They worked side by side, the line between reluctant allies, blurring into a partnership forged in shared danger. They spoke more now, filling the long, watchful nights with stories. She told him of her father, a proud man who loved his land more than anything. He told her about the Rangers, about the simple clarity of fighting for a cause he believed in. He never spoke of Sarah or Daniel. That part of him remained a locked room. Then Silas Cain made his move. He didn't send a few men for a quiet act of sabotage. He brought his entire force down on the ranch like a wildfire. The attack came at dusk, the sky bruised purple and red, as if the heavens themselves were bleeding. They came from all sides, a wave of gunfire and furious war cries that shattered the evening quiet. Jack and Eleanor were ready. They fell back to the fortified ranch house, its thick adobe walls providing the only real cover. Bullets splintered the wooden shutters and thudded into the walls. It was a siege. He's not trying to take the ranch anymore. Eleanor shouted over the din of the battle, reloading her rifle with practiced speed. He's trying to burn it to the ground, with us in it. She was right. Flaming arrows arced through the twilight, thudding into the dried timber of the barn. Within minutes, the structure was engulfed in flames, the fire casting dancing, monstrous shadows across the yard. The heat was intense, the air thick with smoke. Jack knew they couldn't hold out. Kane had them outnumbered and outgunned. This wasn't a fight they could win. It was a slaughter. "We have to get out of here," he yelled, grabbing her arm. "There's a dry creek bed behind the house. It should give us enough cover to reach the rocks." They made a break for it out the back door, moving low and fast through the swirling smoke. The chaos of the main assault covered their escape. They scrambled down into the creek bed at the sound of the battle receding slightly, replaced by the roar of the burning barn and their own ragged breathing. They were almost to the safety of the rocks when a figure emerged from the smoke directly in front of them. It was Silas Kane. He wasn't holding a rifle. In his hand was the silver locket glinting in the firelight. Leaving so soon, Silas asked, his voice calm amidst the chaos. He wasn't looking at Jack. His cold eyes were fixed on Eleanor. "I believe this belongs to you, Mr. Thorne. But the lady is coming with me." Before Jack could react, two of Kane's men appeared behind him, their rifles leveled. Jack was caught disarmed by the sight of the locket. In that split second of hesitation, Silas lunged, grabbing Eleanor and pressing a pistol to her temple. "Don't be a fool," Thorne, Silas hissed, dragging a struggling Eleanor back toward the firelight. "I have what I want. You want answers. You want your precious trinket back. Come and find me. Black Creek mine. Come alone." Jack watched helpless as they disappeared into the smoke and chaos. The main assault on the house was just a diversion, a brilliantly executed plan to isolate them and take Eleanor. Rage, cold and pure, surged through Jack. He was about to charge after them when something Silas had said stopped him cold. "I have what I want." He didn't mean Eleanor. He meant leverage. He meant bait. As the last of Kane's men rode away, leaving the barn to burn itself out, Jack found a piece of paper pinned to the smoldering gatepost. It was a note scrawled in elegant script. "Your father always said the Vance girl was as stubborn as her old man. I wonder how stubborn she'll be when the vultures start circling. Black Creek, don't be late." The handwriting was familiar, but it was the detail that made Jack's blood run cold. He had mentioned Eleanor's stubbornness in his wire to Marshal Evans, a private observation meant to convey the difficulty of their situation. Only one other person had seen that message. The betrayal hit him with the force of a physical blow. Marshal Evans. The tired, incompetent old man was a traitor. He hadn't been clumsy, he had been complicit. Every piece of flawed information, every delayed response, every wild goose chase, it was all part of Silas Kane's plan. Jack had been led by the nose from the very beginning. He stood alone amidst the ruins of Eleanor's hopes, the burning barn his only light. The fight for the ranch was over. The real battle, a final confrontation born of secrets and sins, was about to begin. And Jack was riding into it alone against an enemy who knew his every move and a truth he was terrified to face. The ride to Black Creek Mine was a journey through a dying world. The landscape was a skeletal expanse of rock and sand bleached by a merciless sun. A storm was brewing on the horizon, the clouds a dark, angry bruise in the sky. The wind began to rise, kicking up dust that stung Jack's eyes and coated his throat. It was as if the land itself was holding its breath, waiting for the coming violence. Black Creek was a ghost town. A collection of dilapidated shacks and skeletal mining structures clinging to the side of a barren mountain. It was a place where dreams had come to die, and the howling wind, whistling through the empty buildings, sounded like the lament of forgotten souls. A sandstorm was rolling in the sky, turning a sickly yellow-brown. Visibility was dropping with every passing minute. It was the perfect stage for a final act. Jack dismounted at the edge of town, leaving his horse in a relatively sheltered ravine. He moved on foot, his Winchester in hand, a ghost among ghosts. The sand swirled around him, muffling sound and distorting shapes. The creak of a loose shutter, the groan of a rusted sign, every noise was a potential threat. He found them in the old assay office, the largest building still standing. Through a grimy window, he saw the scene: Eleanor tied to a chair, her face pale but defiant. And Silas Kane standing by the window, calmly polishing the silver locket with a gloved thumb. Jack kicked the door in. It flew off its hinges, crashing to the floor in a cloud of dust and splintered wood. Silas didn't even flinch. He turned slowly, a thin, cruel smile on his lips. "Right on time, Thorne," he said, his voice cutting through the howl of the wind. "I was beginning to think you'd lost your nerve." "Let her go, Kane," Jack said, his rifle leveled at Silas's chest. "All in good time," Silas replied, pocketing the locket. "First, a history lesson. You look at me and you see an outlaw, a thief. But you don't even know your own story, do you? You're so busy running from your father's name, you never stop to ask what sins it carried." From the shadows in the corner of the room, a third figure stepped forward. It was Marshal Evans, his face grim, a shotgun held loosely in his hands. Marshal, Jack growled, his suspicion confirmed as cold, hard fact. "I'm sorry, son," Evans said, his voice weary. "Some debts have to be paid." "He's not paying a debt," Silas corrected, his eyes burning with a righteous fury. "He's easing a guilty conscience." "Isn't that right, Marshal? Tell him. Tell Augustus Thorne's son what you helped his father do." Evans looked down, unable to meet Jack's gaze. "There was another family in this territory," he began, his voice barely a whisper. "The Redfields. They owned the land north of here, the best water rights in the county. Augustus wanted it. He tried to buy them out, to muscle them out, but they wouldn't break." Silas picked up the story, his voice dripping with venom. "So your father did what he always did. He took it. One night, he and his hired guns, including a young, ambitious deputy named Evans, rode out to the Redfield ranch. They didn't go to threaten. They went to erase. They slaughtered them all. Men, women, children. The wind howled outside, a chorus for the damned. The truth was a physical force pressing in on Jack, stealing the air from his lungs. I was 10 years old. Silas continued, his voice cracking with a pain that was still raw after all these years. "I was hiding in the root cellar. I heard everything. I watched from a crack in the boards as your father stood over my mother's body and laughed. He said, 'Now the land is clean.'" He took a step forward, his eyes locking with Jack's. "My full name is Silas Kane Redfield. The raid that killed your family wasn't a random act of violence. It was justice. An eye for an eye. A family for a family." The world tilted under Jack's feet. His entire life, the grief that had defined him, the vengeance that had driven him, it was all built on a lie. His wife and son hadn't died at the hands of nameless savages. They had been payment for his father's sins. He was not a victim of circumstance. He was the heir to a bloody throne. The sandstorm hit the building with the force of a tidal wave. A shutter ripped from its hinges and flew across the room. In the chaos, Jack fired. Not at Silas, but at the lantern hanging from the ceiling. It exploded, plunging the room into near darkness, lit only by the flickering, storm-choked daylight. He dove for cover as Evans's shotgun boomed the blast, tearing a hole in the wall where he had been standing. The fight was on, a desperate, brutal struggle in the swirling dust and darkness. Jack was no longer fighting for simple revenge. He was fighting for Eleanor, for a chance at redemption from a legacy he never chose, and against the terrible, crushing weight of the truth. He moved through the shadows, a man unmade and remade. In the heart of the storm, his father's ghost and Silas's vengeance battling for his soul. The storm raged, turning the assay office into a maelstrom of sand and screaming wind. Jack used the chaos, the disorienting darkness, as his weapon. He was a ranger again, relying on instinct and training. He moved silently along the wall, his senses sharp. He could hear Evan's wheezing breath and Silas's calm, steady footsteps. He circled around behind a stack of old ore carts. Evans, panicked by the darkness, fired his shotgun again, the blast illuminating the room in a flash of orange light. In that brief moment, Jack saw his opening. He lunged, tackling the old marshal, sending them both crashing to the floor. The shotgun flew from Evans' grasp. Jack's fist connected with the marshal's jaw, and the old man went limp. One down, Silas's voice echoed from across the room, unnervingly calm. "You have your father's brutality, Thorne. It's in your blood. My father is dead." Jack snarled into the darkness. "This is between you and me." He saw a flicker of movement near the chair where Eleanor was tied. Silas was using her as a shield. Jack couldn't risk a shot. He had to draw him out. He grabbed a loose floorboard and hurled it against the far wall. Silas fired instantly at the sound, the muzzle flash giving Jack his position. Jack charged not at Silas, but at Eleanor. He slammed into the chair, knocking it and her to the floor out of the direct line of fire. He fumbled with the ropes binding her wrists, his knife flashing in the gloom. "Get out of here," he yelled as the ropes fell away. Silas was on him in an instant, the fight devolving into a raw, desperate brawl. They crashed through a table, their fists finding purchase in the darkness. Silas was wiry and strong, fueled by decades of hatred. Jack was driven by a new terrible clarity. He wasn't just fighting an outlaw, he was fighting the embodiment of his father's sins. The struggle carried them toward the shattered window. The storm tore at them, sand blasting their faces. With a final desperate heave, Jack shoved Silas through the opening. Silas cried out as he tumbled into the raging storm outside. Jack scrambled to his feet, pulling Eleanor up with him. "We have to go. Now." They stumbled out of the office and into the fury of the storm. The wind was a solid wall, threatening to knock them from their feet. Jack saw Silas staggering to his feet a few yards away, his face a mask of bloody fury. He raised his pistol, but a sudden violent gust of wind ripped a sheet of corrugated tin from a nearby roof. It cartwheeled through the air and struck Silas, sending him down hard. Jack didn't wait to see if he was dead or alive. He grabbed Eleanor's hand and pulled her toward the shelter of the ravine where he'd left his horse. They collapsed behind a wall of rock, the storm raging around them, finally safe from the immediate danger. As the fury of the sandstorm began to subside, giving way to a gray, exhausted calm, Jack made his way back to the assay office. He found Marshal Evans tied up with his own ropes, groaning. Outside, half buried in a drift of sand, lay Silas Kane. He was alive, his leg broken, his fight gone. The harsh wilderness would be his judge and jury. Jack looked down at the man who had destroyed his life to avenge his own. He felt no triumph, only a vast, hollow emptiness. He took the silver locket from Silas's pocket. Holding it, he felt the full weight of the tragedy. It wasn't a symbol of his loss anymore. It was a symbol of a legacy of pain, passed from one generation to the next. He left Silas for the law to find, and dragged the traitorous marshal back to Eleanor. In the quiet aftermath of the storm, as the first rays of a new sun broke through the clouds, Jack and Eleanor sat together. He was wounded not just by the fight, but by the truth which had cut him deeper than any bullet. She cleaned the gash on his forehead with a gentle hand. "His sins aren't yours, Jack," she said softly, her voice the first kind thing he had heard in years. "You didn't swing the sword. You don't have to carry it. Unless you choose to." Her words settled in the quiet space of his shattered soul. He had spent 5 years letting his father's legacy, twisted and misunderstood, define him as a man bent on vengeance. Now he had a choice. He took Marshal Evans back to redemption and delivered him to the territorial authorities, his testimony sealing the old man's fate. Then he rode out alone, not west into the sunset, but back toward the ruins of his old homestead. The place was just as he'd left it, a collection of charred timbers and stone foundations, a monument to a life that had been violently erased. Weeds grew through the floorboards where his son used to play. He walked to the center of what was once his home and stood there for a long time, the silver locket heavy in his hand. He saw her then in his mind's eye. Sarah smiling, telling him he was a good man, better than his father. He had tried to be. He walked to the edge of the property, to a lone surviving oak tree whose branches reached toward the sky like gnarled arms in prayer. Its roots ran deep, holding firm to the scorched earth. With his bare hands, he dug a small hole in the ground at its base. He held the locket one last time, whispered a final silent goodbye, and placed it in the earth. As he covered it with soil, he wasn't just burying a piece of silver. He was burying the ghost of Augustus Thorne. He was burying the man who hunted for vengeance. He was letting go. He stood up, his hands dirty, his heart strangely light. For the first time in 5 years, the future was not a terrifying void, but an open plain. He got on his horse and looked at the horizon. He could ride away, disappear again, become another ghost on the frontier. But Eleanor's words echoed in his mind. Unless you choose to. He thought of her strength, of the ranch she would have to rebuild, of the possibility of a life not defined by the past, but built from its ashes. He turned his horse not away from the world, but back toward it. Back toward redemption. Back toward a future he might, with her, be able to build. It was a new trail, one of healing and hope, and he was finally ready to see where it led.